And Obama made very clear in that initial document that he signed soon after taking office that his goals in Afghanistan and in neighboring Pakistan were to be very clear and focused. They were to be to disrupt, dismantle, and defeat al-Qaeda in both of those nations. But the plan to achieve that goal was going to be expansive. Instead of simply focusing on killing or capturing senior al-Qaeda leaders, the White House plan envisaged building an Afghan state that will be strong enough and stable enough to essentially resist any al-Qaeda operatives that sought to cross back into Afghanistan from their sanctuaries in neighboring Pakistan. And that involved doing what the Americans should have done back in 2001, building an Afghan government, training a new Afghan army, and providing essential services to the Afghan people. And so at the end of the Second World War, 1946, when this club was founded, as Europe was digging out of its rubble, Afghanistan was sitting on a comparative windfall. It had $100 million in gold and silver reserves sitting in its treasury. And so the young king in Kabul, 32-year-old Mohammad Zahir Shah, who'd been very impressed with what the United States had done during the Great Depression in the Tennessee Valley, looked over at the barren expanse of Helmand Province in the southwest of his country and thought, perhaps if I could harness the raging waters of the Hindu Kush, I could turn this barren desert into verdant farmland and ease the pain of frequent food shortages in my country. So what did he do? He had all this money in his treasury. He turned to the world's preeminent construction and engineering firm at the time, San Francisco-based company called Morrison Knudsen, which had built the Bay Bridge and before that the Hoover Dam. And so using Afghanistan's own money, this wasn't a foreign aid project, the Afghans hired Morrison Knudsen to come into Helmand Province, the very same province that our Marines are stationed in today, to dig a network of irrigation canals to create essentially the Afghan version of California's Imperial Valley. This whole project, there were ample histories of it written by USAID, by other government experts. They sit in the National Archives, in the Library of Congress, in the files at State and Aid. But nobody in Washington back in 2009, or let me widen the aperture, between 2001 and 2009, nobody bothered to engage with this stuff, to read this history, to connect the dots. Because if they did, I dare say, it might have advocated a little bit more pause before we embarked on yet another grand effort at nation building in Afghanistan. So let's start with strategy. Let me state up front that I believe COIN can work if the conditions are right and the cost is merited. But for COIN to have prevailed in Afghanistan, several things needed to occur. The Afghan government had to be a willing partner. The Pakistani government had to be willing to crack down on insurgent sanctuaries on its own soil. The American people had to be supportive of this effort and willing to commit the necessary resources required to sustain a lengthy counterinsurgency campaign. And finally, the Afghan army had to be ready and willing to assume control of areas cleared by American forces. Number two, the Pakistani government. Now, after the Talibs relocated en masse into Pakistan in late 2001, after the commencement of Operation Enduring Freedom, the Pakistani intelligence service, the ISI, essentially gave them a degree of sanctuary. They were allowed to move in there, to reestablish their informal networks, but the Pakistanis kind of refrained from overt assistance. They weren't giving them money or weapons, but the Talibs could raise their own, they could buy their own weapons, which wasn't all that hard to do in Pakistan. But starting in 2009, as we started surging troops into that country, based on the assumption that Pakistan would sort of see the light and start to crack down on the Talibs because they were facing their own blowback from the Pakistani offshoot of the Taliban. Instead, the ISI did the exact opposite thing. They started to get far more hands-on with the Taliban, providing them cash and weapons and intelligence via civilian intermediaries. By early 2011, according to one estimate, at least half of all Taliban commanders were receiving active support from Pakistan security services. Let's look at the domestic side of things for one quick second. The price tag. Was it worth it? You know, it costs on average about $1 million a year to keep one U.S. service member in Afghanistan. That means that the annual tab for the war in 2010 and 2011 was about $100 billion a year. Is achieving a marginally less bad outcome in Afghanistan worth that expense? with other pressing security challenges, Iran, North Korea, political upheaval in the Middle East, is it prudent to be tying up so many of our forces and dispersing so many precious dollars in remote Afghan villages? Now I want to address briefly the operational failure. Agree or disagree, the surge was the president's strategy, and the government beneath him had an obligation to make their best efforts to implement it. But each part of our government made critical errors, and I'm going to go through a couple of them. The first is the Pentagon. And I'm going to say something that might be a little impolitic in the Marines Memorial Club, but I'm going to preface this by saying I love our Marines. I've spent weeks on end with our Marines deployed, and I count as some of my dearest friends Marine officers. And I have to say, this is a critique that, quite frankly, many of my Marine friends, many senior Marine officers, privately agree with, even though they can't say so publicly. Back in the summer of 2009, as we were sending that first tranche of forces into the country, the most at-risk part of Afghanistan was the southern city of Kandahar, country's second largest population center. It's essentially the Pashtun heartland. It was a spiritual capital for the Taliban. And if they could have seized it, and the Talibs were essentially on the gates of Kandahar, if they could have seized Kandahar, they would have had a springboard to capture much of the rest of the country, as they did in the 1990s. So you would think perhaps that we would have deployed the first tranche of those forces to the areas in and around Kandahar to protect it. But instead, we sent them off to neighboring Helmand province, where we dug those canals in the 1940s and 50s. But an area of Afghanistan that was home to fewer than 1% of the country's population, even though we were supposedly implementing a counterinsurgency strategy that called for protecting the population. Why? Tribal rivalries, not in Afghanistan, but in the Pentagon. That first tranche of forces was comprised of U.S. Marines. And the Marines, a large Marine brigade, the 2nd Marine Expeditionary Brigade, wanted to fight as what they called a MAGTAF, a Marine Air Ground Task Force. And they wanted to bring their own helicopters, their own logistics units, their own intelligence assets. And what they wanted was essentially what in the military they call contiguous battle space. They wanted their own area to operate, their own airspace. And Kandahar would be too complicated of an environment to create contiguous Marine battle space because there were already US and Canadian forces operating in there. So top NATO commanders essentially carved out a part of Helmand province that could be given exclusively to the Marines. The Marines did great things in Helmand, but it wasn't the most important fight. They should have been sent to the areas in and around Kandahar. Had they done so, we could have essentially gained a year of the surge and allowed Generals Petraeus and Allen the flexibility to swing more of those forces to the east before the troop drawdown deadlines kicked in. We tried to spend, in 2010, $4 billion on reconstruction projects in a single year in that country. Far more than Afghanistan could reasonably absorb. In some parts of the South, and where the Marines were operating, it equated to more money than the per capita income of every man, woman, and child. Not surprisingly, it wound up fueling the very corruption we were trying to stem. My last quick point about the failures in operationalizing the surge was back in Washington. I'll get the subtitle of the book from all that. You know, while I was out in Afghanistan, I discovered that actually there was a second war going on, and it was a war inside the Beltway. It was the war within the war. And the nastiest battle there was occurring between the State Department and the White House, specifically between Richard Holbrooke, the late veteran diplomat who had been brought in by Hillary Clinton to help chart a path toward possible peace talks with the Taliban, and the President's National Security Council. Now, Holbrooke, I should note, there was never a disagreement about policy here. Both the White House and the State Department both believed that you weren't never going to be able to kill every last single Talib, and the only way you were going to reasonably end this conflict was around a negotiating table. So policy, total agreement. It was personality that was the problem. And so Obama's senior national security aides essentially set out to undercut Holbrooke. They prevented him from using military aircraft to travel out to the region. They scheduled key meetings when he was out of town. They belittled him in front of the leaders of Afghanistan and Pakistan. The infighting that took place inside the Beltway squandered our best opportunity to try to forge a path toward possible peace talks with the Taliban. For the very year that we had our most leverage, when we were sending troops in as opposed to pulling troops out, Washington was too consumed with fighting itself as opposed to rowing in unison to try to achieve a shared objective.
You wrote about the alternative to growing poppies. And could you tell the story that you tell in your book about cotton?
A 1986 act of Congress passed or introduced by then Senator Dale Bumpers of Arkansas, designed to protect king cotton in the United States that prevents the use of any U.S. taxpayer money from helping another country's cotton industry. Now, I suppose the White House could have, issued a waiver saying it was in the national security interest of our country to do so, but nobody at aid wanted to take on this fight. So here you have a crop that Afghans want to grow, and aid won't do anything. Now, there is a good news coda to this, because God love our Marines. They don't care if aid is making a stupid decision. They don't care if policy says one thing. And so starting in late 2010, early 11, the Marines embarked on what was essentially a rogue effort to try to help Afghans restart their cotton industry. And I'm happy to say that like a third of the farmland in Marja now, which used to be all poppy, is actually cotton farms, and the Marines use some of their own discretionary funds to buy machinery to be able to compress the bale so the Afghans could take it to market. And one should note, the story, as it's told in the book, is far more maddening because, the roads in southern Afghanistan are all rutted. It's sometimes dangerous to take your stuff to market. And so, cotton's ideal because, you can take that on any surface. You're not going to ruin your cotton crop, and you don't have to take it to market right away. Instead, the aid guys would come in and say, oh, you should grow watermelons. Well, watermelons are require you to have like big trucks to move it to market if you want to make any money. If you have like potholed roads, which there's no asphalt down there, your watermelons will turn into watermelon juice. And oh, by the way, aid distributed so many watermelon seeds that it crashed the markets for melons there because nobody had any money to make, and people just destroyed their watermelon crops. But thankfully, the Marines saw the problem with all this and embarked on literally their own U.S. Marine Corps agriculture policy in southern Afghanistan.